Hello everyone. Welcome to the Easy Power Thursday webinar series. My name is Jim Chastain. I'm your host for today's presentation. And before I introduce our guest speaker, as we are in the habit of doing, we'd like to run a couple poll questions and see where everyone stands with respect to the topic. So if you would please participate by responding. Obviously, there's no obligation or liability, strictly informational only. So the first question is, have you attended a NFPA 70E or ZSA Z462 2021 training session? I think part of that is a recognition that the standard changes every 3 years, and it's relatively important to stay abreast of the current changes. So we almost have a quorum here. Let's leave this another 5 seconds. We do appreciate everyone attending today, and by all means during the presentation you're welcome to use the question box to present questions for Terry to follow up on. So here's how folks have weighed in. So it looks like a good audience for the presentation reception, so good. So the second question is, do you or does your client have a documented electrical safety program? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's strictly specifically what your situation is, and there's no downside liability. So it looks like we have a quorum. Thank you. And here we have a majority opinion. That's good to know. And then finally, has your company a documented electrical work permit policy process in place? So this one's a little trickier. I'll be curious to see how we stand on this one. Trickier only because it's something that often is overlooked by people, even though they have a study completed. And I'm looking forward to Terry's presentation on this. So it looks like we have a quorum and pretty even split here. All that's good information. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. Terry Becker, a senior IEEE Safety Committee member and a leading thought leader in the field of electrical safety. So give me a second, Terry, and I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Jim, thanks for that introduction. Those poll questions were very interesting, and they'll be relevant to the topic today, this energized electrical work permit, yes or no. So again, just my background, a little more information again than Jim provided. I'm an electrical engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada, 30 years experience. Specifically been concentrating the last almost 15 years of my career on electrical safety consulting. My background before that was oil and gas, large oil and gas based out of Calgary. I'm a Z462 tech committee member, the Canadian version of NFPA 70. I'm actually a founding member, the first FAST vice chair, and I'm a working group leader for Clause 4.1 in the annexes. In Canada, we also created a maintenance of electrical system standard. In 2013, it became a standard. In 2018, it's the equivalent of NFPA 70B for the US, not the same as far as content, but I'm a voting member on that tech committee as well. And I'm also a voting member on IEEE 1584, a guide for arc flash hazard calculation standard, and also the 1584 subcommittee. So 14 years specifically in electrical safety consulting, and as a priority, I do electrical safety audits and program development, and then the training, the standard arc flash and shock training, and present at conferences and enjoy doing webinars like this. And I really want to thank, Jim and Easy Power for allowing me to present my ideas. I like this comment. I'm sort of a thought leader. I'm trying to interpret these standards from a reasonable and practical perspective. So a bit of a disclaimer again that what I'm presenting today are my opinions and or my company's opinions, and I really accept no liability for the information provided. You're advised to contact NFPA for a specific interpretation of the published 2021 edition, and or the CSA group for any specific interpretation of the published 2021 edition of Z462. The last bullet's the most important one. Employers are expected to have developed and implemented a compliant electrical safety program as required by NFPA 70E and CSA Z462, and related occupational health and safety management system standards for the US, ANSI Z10, and for Canada, CSA Z45001. And that's really important relative to the topic of this energized electrical work permit, yes or no. And we'll get into that as I go through the material. So the poll questions tell me that, it's interesting. Again, most of the attendees haven't had, NFPA 70 or Z462 training, so you may not be familiar with the energized electrical work permit requirement. That is a mandatory prescriptive requirement within 70E and Z462, and that's fine. We'll go through that today, and I'll try and frame that in the time that I have with respect to this permit and how it's positioned in 70E and Z462. And yet, your comment was that, if your consultant, your clients maybe have an electrical safety program, 71%. And I was interested by that statistic because my experience in industry is that most companies do not have electrical safety programs, specifically electrical contractors, but the owners, that statistic seems high for the poll, just to let you know. And then the energized electrical work permit, it's interesting because if you don't have an electrical safety program, then you really shouldn't be deploying an energized electrical work permit policy. All right. So, but I'll go through some of this information and frame it for everybody today. So again, brief introduction. I'll talk about the electrical safety program requirement. And then I've got what is energized electrical work, because it's important that we understand that, because it relates to this energized electrical work permit and when the permit would be required or not, the yes or no in today's webinar. I also continue to talk about, managing myths and misinformation, and I'll list those, but the permit, it does relate to some of those myths and misinformation that are out there. And these are, again, myths or misinformation that I believe, and I'll talk about those. And one of them is it against the law to perform energized electrical work? And this has come up, and the energized electrical work permits come up, and I'm going, well, and I'll talk about that, but it is not against the law to perform energized electrical work, and there's no legal requirement for the energized electrical work permit. The energized electrical work permit would be voluntarily applied by an employer in their electrical safety program. And then I'll review the 70E and Z462 requirements, and we are technically harmonized on the energized electrical work permit between 70E and Z462, but I'll sort of, make sure we understand where all this is coming from. And then I'll talk about the energized electrical work permit to sort of end the webinar. And again, I'm going to question the status quo. I'm going to say, hey, let's ensure we interpret this permit. Let's not let it shut down our company from doing energized electrical work, because that's not the intent. But again, what's happening again, back to the myths and misinformation is different aspects of 70E and Z462 are being misinterpreted by industry, by getting information from someone else that may have a different, perspective on it. So I'm going to give you my perspective specific to the energized electrical work permit. So the introduction. So in NFPA 70E and Article 110.5, Electrical Safety Program, and CSA Z462 Clause 417, right, the employer is supposed to have an electrical safety program, right? So they're supposed to implement and document an overall electrical safety program that directs activity appropriate to the risk associated with electrical hazards. There's also a definition of what this electrical safety program is included, and it's a documented system consisting of electrical safety principles, policies, procedures, and processes that directs activities appropriate for the risk associated with electrical hazards. So underneath this electrical safety program would be this energized electrical work permit as part of that documented system. And there really should be a policy embedded in the electrical safety program. All right, so the developed program should have a policy with respect to the energized electrical work permit and the company's interpretation of its requirements. And a company could strictly say, hey, we're going to need a permit for everything, which I wouldn't sponsor. You do not need an energized electrical work permit for every work task, because you're going to have people doing, signatures quite a bit, and it becomes bureaucratic. The permit's not adding any value. So if you misinterpret the permit conservatively, you're getting these permits signed like every day and multiple times when energized work tasks are performed, and that really isn't what you should be doing with the permit. All right, so I'm going to talk about the requirement for the energized electrical work permit. Again, the concept of, yes or no. When do we need it? When do we don't? All right, so what is energized electrical work? So the definition in 70 and Z462 provides us with two options: diagnostics or repair. But I always talk about the fact that we've got to consider that there's operating related work tasks, opening and closing circuit breakers or disconnect switches, right, as an example. and isolation-related work tasks, which are not maintenance work tasks. They're specific to isolating electrical equipment. And under operating in isolation, I've noted, part of the establishing electrically safe work condition procedure that's also another important element of 70 and Z462 requires operating electrical equipment and doing these isolation work tasks of racking in or out low voltage power circuit breakers or high voltage power circuit breakers. Again, and for high voltage, installing temporary protected ground. So you need to take, the list of energized electrical work tasks that are embedded in 70 and Z462, and you need to still interpret them and further classify, what these work tasks are. So working on is diagnostics and repair, but operating is not working on, it's operating the equipment. And again, it's a function of the energized electrical equipment. It's designed to be operated. And normal equipment conditions, I'm going to make a statement. You don't need arc flash or shock PP to operate energized electrical equipment when you have a normal equipment condition. Now, that's an element of risk, which is a different discussion than the need for the permit. So managing myths and misinformation. So these are propagating out there. Most of them relate to arc flash, and unfortunately, that's another discussion, and I've talked about it in previous webinars, that the narrative is overwhelmed by arc flash, but in reality, it's the shock hazard that we should be paying more attention to, because statistically we have evidence of fatal injuries, electrocutions due to shock. But again, arc flash, we just don't have that same frequency. So a lot of these are propagated, some of them related to arc flash, some of them are just general policy, like the first one. I said earlier, it is against the law to work energized. That is not true. But you can interpret regulations depending on the employer that maybe it is. Well, it's not, right? And that's, again, my interpretation, but it's not against the law. And we need qualified persons to be confident that they can perform energized electrical work without retribution, that they're going to lose their qualification ticket, right, as a journey person electrician because they're working energized. So there's a problem here too with a lot of these myths that the worker, may refuse to work energized because they believe they're going to, lose their ticket. So it's not true. That qualified person, depending on the trade training underneath that designation, is the worker that we do need to perform energized work, and we need them to be confident about it. That's an element of risk. Testing for absence of voltage doesn't require arc flash and shock PP. That's not true. Until you establish 0 volts with an approved test instrument, you're going to need to complete an arc flash and shock risk assessment to determine additional protective measures required. The third one is another myth. It's dangerous. There's no PP for energized work greater than 40 calories. That's a false statement. Arc blast pressure doesn't correlate to incident energy, as defined by Dr. Ralph Lee's research and a graph that's published in the old IEEE Yellow Book, which is now the new IEEE 3007 series, right? So that's another sort of myth, but it does relate to this. Well, can we do energized work? When do we need the permit, right? The next one says, I'm the president of my company, my contracting company. I just emailed a policy that we don't work live here. Well, that's actually a negligent statement, because every electrician has a test instrument and does voltage measurements to test for voltage or test for absence. All energized electrical equipment is inherently high likelihood of having an arcing fault. Well, that's not true either. Arc blast pressure will pulverize you. That's not true either. Operating energized electrical equipment requires full body arc flash PP warrant at all times. That's not true. If I go into the electrical room, I need full body arc flash PP warrant just to go into the room. That's not true either. And the arc flash and shock equipment label with the results from the arc flash hazard incident analysis study, it's on the electrical equipment. The arc flash boundary is real right now. That's not true, right? The work task determines if the worker is exposed to shock and an abnormal arcing fault and an arc flash, depending on the voltage of the electrical equipment to sustain the abnormal arcing fault. Just again, embellishing on some of these myths and misinformation, and some of these directly relate to the energized electrical work permit. So on the screen, I've got sort of 5 editions of 70E and Z462. We didn't have CSA Z462 until January 2009, right? So I've just sort of got 5 editions. You had NFPA 70E since 1979, but 70E really hadn't matured much until the 2004 edition, right? And this is when things changed. There was more information, hazardous categories, and arc flash. So it's really the 2004 edition where things really changed. And then if we look at the latest editions of 2021 70E, things have accelerated from initially identify hazard and put on PPE to the last 3 editions, electrical hazard identification and risk assessment. So that is a separate topic than the energized electrical work permit. This is the point I'm trying to make, right? So the permit is a yes/no permission type document. And then separate from the permit, if we don't have a permit, you always have to have electrical hazard identification and a risk assessment completed and the hierarchy of risk control methods applied by the qualified person to, again, reduce risk if we are doing energized work. So energized work is authorized. It is, right? It's just a matter of how the permit, the energized electrical work permit, is interpreted. So with respect to the electrical safety program, it is developed based on what's expected for a framework or table of contents in occupational health and safety management system standards. So ANSI Z10 for the US, CSA Z45001 for Canada, because Canada adopted ISO 45001. And those are occupational health and safety management system standards. Separately, if you weren't aware, OSHA actually provides guidance, but you got to dig around for it on their website, on the recommended practices for safety and health programs. And it gives guidance on what should be in a program. It has 7 elements, right? And it's this plan, do, check, act philosophy that's in ANSI Z10 and in CSA Z45001 that I'm going to talk about and frame the program and frame where the permit would show up, right? So we've got these regulatory obligations. We need to plan around that, right? And part of that would be to review and develop an overall occupational health and safety management system, and as per 7D and Z462, a compliant electrical safety program, all right? And then when we have the program and we have these controls or a policy for the permit, we've got to monitor and measure and manage that in real time. So if we did have a permit, you need to track the permit, I would track it, and record the dates, the times, the work, and have those as KPIs on, when and if we have this permit, why, right? And really the permit should never be used. There's the other rub. Your program should have it as a policy, but in reality, if we're using a permit, to my interpretation, it would be issued for repair or alteration work tasks if it is issued for anything, because the remaining work tasks would be exempted due to equipment design, and we're going to get there. All right, so plan, do, check, act, right? So implement an electrical safety program, include an energized electrical work permit policy, and as the employer, you control that permit and when it's required as yes or no. And then manage, this information real time on and track these permits if they are being used. If there's no permits this year, that's a good KPI, right? Because we're not doing energized repair alteration, right? Again, and I think this is the controversy and topic about this permit. And Terry, what do you mean you're authorizing repair alteration work? Well, I'm not authorizing it. 7D and Z462 allow it if there's justification and an energized electrical work permit is issued with signatures, all right? This is another sort of, graphical flow chart that I use and talk about with respect to electrical safety program due diligence and the framework of it. We've got OH&S regulations, Canada, US. There's a general duty clause that all hazards should be identified, eliminate exposure. All hazards have the same philosophy or policy as 7DE and Z462, right? And then we want to apply the hierarchy of risk control methods if we can't eliminate, all right? And then, again, hazard identification, risk assessment, and we have a occupational health and safety management system developed, and underneath it, we have a supporting electrical safety program for arc flash and shock hazards. We use standard 70E or Z462 for, again, US or Canada, and that plan, do, check, act philosophy is a really overarching, excellent philosophy that I like, right? And then we build this program based on what's expected for occupational health and safety management systems, and we embed an energized electrical work permit policy in our company's electrical safety program. Now, moving on to this energized electrical work permit, right? So that background information now, really you need all of those things in place. You need this program, this electrical safety program, because the permit, I guess you could, but without the rest of the information in that electrical safety program, the permit would be misunderstood, misapplied, or potentially not relevant, right? So because we need an overarching work task-based qualitative risk assessment procedure completed as a priority. The permit, like I said, is a separate policy or a separate document that's a permission type document. And we do look to 70E and Z462 because it's the only place that this energized electrical work permit shows up in relationship to energized electrical work. All right, so this permit, again, ultimately, if you interpret it, a qualified person would need it for any work task they perform where they're exposed to arc flash and shock hazards. And wow, we'd have lots of permits being issued often if that was the case, right? So all energized work tasks would have the permit unless exempted, but the content in 70E, which again is harmonized with Z462, right? Well, it said, well, wait a minute, there's justification for energized electrical work, and the permit's, going to be exempted for some of those work tasks because we can't complete them due to equipment design. All right, so the starting point of the permit was you need it for everything, but there was some recognition that due to justification, the permit's not required, right? It's mute, right? So again, I'm going to show you that information, but what I wanted to do today is to again question the status quo, question what would be, well, that's what it says in 70E. Well, no, that's what it says, but let's interpret the standard from the perspective of how we can make this thing work in the field. How do we get 70 and Z462 to work in the field so that it's there? Ultimately, what we're implementing in our electrical safety programs, adding value, right? It's adding value in trying to eliminate repair alteration work tasks, but not inhibiting, the performance of other energized electrical work tasks that we need to keep being completed by that qualified person. All right. So again, 70E and Z462 identify some exemptions. I'm going to show them here shortly. And then again, I already presented that the permit is separate from electrical hazard classification, electrical hazard identification and risk assessment. That's totally over here. The permit's just this yes, no permission document. And again, the work tasks and they work together, but whether we have the permit or not, you're always going to do electrical hazard identification and risk assessment against the work task performed, right? So I'm trying to de-link these because they're separate. They're separate requirements. So the justification noted in 70E and in Z462, that's justification for energized work, and it says demonstrating de-energizing introduced additional hazard or increased risk, and I've listed the examples that are noted, right? Life support systems, emergency alarm security systems, hazardous location ventilation for future emission or declassification. Again, then it says infeasibility due to equipment design or operational limitations is the second, justification for energized work, and diagnostics and troubleshooting, or a continuous process that would be completely shut down. Now, these examples are even controversial depending on who you talk to. Well, Terry, if we don't turn the power off and there's an abnormal condition, the power is going to be turned off anyways. Well, and then what's the consequences of that? So again, just sort of embellishing and talking about, the listed justifications. Now, as far as equipment voltage, now what I've listed, and I forgot to update this, so equipment is operating at less than or equal to 50 volts AC or DC and 70E. But in Canada, we changed those low voltage thresholds to 30 volts AC or 60 volts DC in the 2021 edition. Now, this has been moving around in 70E, but ultimately what's happening is OSHA has a 50 volt threshold AC and DC until we can get OSHA updated. Then the actual voltages won't change in 70E, where we're not subjective to that level of oversight in Canada. We put in voltages that are being determined based on electrical hazard classification. And there's a whole other webinar on electrical hazard classification and these voltages of concern for a shock occurring or sustaining an abnormal arcing fault. But again, if your voltages are less than 50 volts AC or DC in the US, or 30 volts AC or 60 volts DC in Canada, we don't need justification. You can perform energized work. There's no arc flash or shock hazard exposure risk to the qualified person. There's still an abnormal arcing fault, but that's not an arc flash. All right, so this is currently the listed justification for energized work. And what we really want to do then is look at the exemptions that are currently in 70 and Z462. So if we look at the exemptions right now, and the first one is testing, troubleshooting, or voltage or current measurements. Well, really, let's just change the wording to say any use of a test instrument doesn't require a permit because of equipment design. How do we do diagnostics if we can't have voltage present? We need voltage present, right, to get different measurements. Well, we need voltage present, then we need to do some load checks so we know what the current is, to again manage our power system, right? So again, we need diagnostics and troubleshooting to be performed energized. So due to equipment design, there's an exemption. Now the next exemption, item 2, says thermography, ultrasonic or visual inspections if the restricted approach boundary for shock is not crossed. So it's saying, well, we can have the equipment open, a door is open, hinged, or a bolt on cover removed. Those are separate work tasks. But the work task of using a thermographic camera, an ultrasonic test instrument, or doing visual inspections, we don't need a permit for that. But it doesn't say that opening the hinge door or removing the bolt on cover is exempted. And I'm going to talk about that because I believe we do need exemptions for those two work tasks. All right, now when I talk about the work tasks, 70E under arc flash risk assessment and Z462 under arc flash risk assessment have work task tables. It's table 130.5C in 70E or table 2 in Z462. There's 31 work tasks in that table. And really what I recommend is that we use those work tasks, and based on, again, the justification of equipment design, we add additional exemptions to work tasks that due to equipment design, well, why do we need the permit? We have to do that work task in an energized state because we can't establish an electrically safe work condition before we actually complete that work task. So these are the 4 exemptions. 3 says access and egress to an area with energized electrical equipment if no electrical work is performed and the restricted approach boundary is not crossed. So I can go into an electrical room and I don't need a permit. And I don't even need arc flash and shock PP to go into the electrical room. If I'm just going in to, again, read panel meters, right, inspect the room visually, right, inspect the electrical equipment externally, right, without opening it up. So we don't need a permit to go into an electrical room. The last one says general housekeeping and miscellaneous non-electrical work if I don't cross the restricted approach boundary. Well, I can do other work in an electrical room, or I can clean the electrical room, right, or bring things that we might have stored in there in or out, and I don't need a permit, right? So I don't need a permit for these 4 items. But what I wanted to do today is get to this next couple of slides, right? Interpret Z462 and 70E in your company's electrical safety program with specific policies, practices, and generic procedure requirements. And with respect to the permit, I recommend additional exemptions can be defined based on infeasibility due to equipment design. Now, just a sidebar, I actually attended the IEEE Electrical Safety Workshop in person this year finally, was glad to. I attended the NETA Power Test Conference this year, which I was glad to. And then we had a local IEEE Electrical Safety Technical Mega Projects Conference in Edmonton that I also attended in person, and I presented at all 3. At the NETA Power Test Conference, I was on an electrical safety panel, and I specifically brought up the topic of this energized electrical work permit. And there was quite a bit of controversy, right? So when I'm presenting with respect to these additional exemptions, that's great. Let's have a debate. Let's have this discussion. That's why I'm doing this webinar today, is to say, hey, you got to interpret these documents. And if the permit is bureaucratic, it's not doing what we want it to do, right? So, but what I'm now going to show you could only be implemented if an employer documents an energized electrical work permit policy in their electrical safety program, that they clearly understand, the topics that I'm presenting, and they're not going to be conservative. Conservative is easy, but conservative isn't the correct way to interpret anything at all, right? You need to be reasonable and practical, because we can't, well, I guess you could in your company, you could shut down operation of your company indirectly by being conservative, right? So we don't want the permit to have a negative economic impact, right, on a company because we're shutting down for everything, right, when it's not reasonable or practicable, right? I don't want repair or alteration to be performed in an energized state, but I want diagnostics and troubleshooting, I want inspections, I want other work to be completed where we don't have a bureaucratical process in place requiring signatures on an energized electrical work permit, right? So I'm going to present these additional exemptions to the energized electrical work permit that would be documented in an employer's electrical safety program, and they accept that. Their electrical safety committee votes and agrees, because these work tasks, why do we need a permit for them? So we clarify that you don't need a permit for operating, because if you go to the extreme level, we'd have to have a permit to operate, like a standing permit. Well, you don't, because there's no legal requirement for that to start out with. I've listed opening hinge doors, energized, with the equipment energized, no permit for that. How do I get to the other side to test for absence of voltage? Or how do I get to the other side to test for voltage or do a load measurement, right? So again, exempt it, right, due to equipment design. Removing bolt-on covers for diagnostic work tasks. So bolt-on covers, diagnostics, or even testing for absence, because the bolt-on cover is energized alteration. So now I'm authorizing one alteration work task, right, because there's physical alteration, right? The bolts are being removed, the cover's being removed, but I'm saying we don't need a permit for that either. Then the isolation work tasks that I mentioned earlier, racking in or out a power circuit breaker, lower high voltage, exempted because of equipment design. We don't need a permit to do that work task. And installing or removing temporary protected grounds, we don't need a permit for that. How do I establish an electrically safe work condition if I don't operate electrical equipment and then, in this case, rack the power circuit breakers in and out, right? And then for high voltage, install temporary protected grounds. The permit becomes purely bureaucratic. The last one is battery terminations. Due to equipment design, how do I eliminate the voltage? I can't. So again, why do I need a permit for battery terminations? I've got the qualified person that's got the qualification training. They're competent on working on this electrical equipment. That's irrelevant actually to the permit requirement. That's an element of risk, right? The permit is purely permission, right? Electrical hazard identification and risk assessment would still be completed against these work tasks. And if there's arc flash and shock PP needed, then the employer would determine that, right? So again, these are just the permit being issued or not, right? Again, an energized electrical work permit, yes or no. I recommend these additional exemptions being documented in employer's electrical safety program and that permits aren't issued. Permits are not issued for these individual work tasks. All right, so that's where I wanted to go today to get to this point and this potentially very controversial slide. But in my opinion, it's not controversial. This is taking control of the standard and interpreting it, and again, reasonably interpreting it, and from a practical perspective, right? So again, that's what I wanted to talk about today, because in my experience, I'm arriving, and talking to companies about, an electrical safety program, and they've already said, well, we issue the permit for everything. I'm going, what? Right? Well, and we heard it was against the law, or the electricians did, and they want the permit, or else they're not going to work energized on our site. And I'm going, well, that's a totally different discussion about the permit, and a qualified person or an electrician thinking that they need the permit to protect themselves, because if they don't have the permit, they're going to lose their ticket. And that's really skewed off into, a bizarre location where I am hearing about some information being communicated, right, incorrectly, that it's against the law to do energized electrical work. That's not true, right? It's not true. And if it is against the law, we've got a big problem, because I don't know what we're going to do, right? How do we do diagnostics? How do we do troubleshooting? How do we operate the electrical equipment if it's not energized? How do we isolate the electrical equipment if we don't do work tasks that are inherently energized to isolate the electrical equipment, right? So the gist of today's webinar was to get to this slide, where I recommend additional exemptions be documented in employer's electrical safety program. And again, this is a flow chart that's in 70 and Z462. You would create a custom version of it to include the additional exemptions. And then I just included a templated permit that's consistent with NFPA 70 and Z462. So this would be the permit that if we do need it, that's what it would look like. But if we exempt, these additional work tasks, there'd be 10 or 11 work tasks that is exempted. And then the other work tasks where it is truly repair or alteration, they would require the permit with justification, if there is justification. If not, we establish an electrically safe work condition, and then we do that de-energized repair or alteration work, which is the desired state for that work that I do want. But I don't want us to debilitate, our normal operation of our facility and having the day-to-day, maintenance, diagnostic, troubleshooting work tasks that would be reactive in nature, maybe, or, as per PMs, right? So I don't want the permit to be a bureaucratic element of the day-to-day work that's completed. All right, so bringing things to a conclusion, interpreting 70 and Z462 is required by the employer. Don't necessarily accept it on par. Yeah, it has prescriptive requirements in it, but still interpret the prescriptive requirements, and specifically the energized electrical work permit. Ensure you understand what energized electrical work is. Again, with my classifications of adding, operating, and isolation work tasks, manage myths and misinformation, and do it through your electrical safety program and through the policies that you define in your electrical safety program. Document and interpret in a compliant electrical safety program those policies, practices, and procedural requirements. It's really the electrical safety programs to document. 70E is a toolbox. Z462 are toolboxes. They aren't electrical safety programs. They're standards. The permit, again, is a mandatory requirement of 70E and Z462. I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm agreeing that it is. But as provided, the exemptions, right, can be expanded upon. All right, so not all energized work tasks require a permit. There's the listed exemptions, and then I'm stimulating thought, and again, practical interpretation that we can have additional exemptions documented and implemented by an employer. All right, so we want that permit applied through that policy in the electrical safety program, and then add in those additional exemptions, and then communicate that to your workers. That in our company, you've had that generic 7E training. We're adding additional exemptions due to equipment design. Right? We don't want the permit to be bureaucratic. We want it to add value when there is a request for repair or alteration work tasks. Adding circuit breakers into a panel board and installing conductors into an energized panel board. I want the power turned off for that. All right. So again, that is what I wanted to present today. And I just want to end by thanking Easy Power, thanking Jim for continuing to give me a venue to share my opinions, my perspectives. I liked what he said. I'm trying to be a thought leader and trying to make this work out there. And that's the challenge, is trying to get 7E and Z462, adding the true value that we want them to, which is elimination or reduce risk when we do these energized work tasks. But let's get rid of, potential bureaucracy or misunderstanding by the qualified person related to the energized electrical work permit.
Thank you, Terry. I always look forward to a good dose of common sense when you're on the webinar.
I'll field any questions.
Well, so the first question that came in was, because there's a lot of information in the slides, is it possible to get a copy of the presentation in PDF form that we could post along with the video?
Sure, no problem.
And then Ollie has a couple additions, I think, to your list. He says also de-energizing of capacity devices like reactors, cables, overhead lines, power cables, transformers, capacitors that are critical, just as likewise energizing equipment safety matters. I think he's talking about grounding systems and not having a permit for kind of typical requirements for making the equipment safe.
Well, and I would embellish that if you want to get more granular on the work tasks, go right ahead. But ultimately, the 31 work tasks in Table 130.5C in 70E or Table 2 in Z462 are really good. But I do say, hey, if you want to, add more detail to those work tasks or add work tasks, go right ahead and then further clarify, in a task table, and you can use that table to then advise, the user of the table if an energized electrical work permit is required or not.
Yeah, and that's all the more reason for making sure it's a company policy, not something that's unmovable as far as legal deals.
Or I went to a training session and then the instructor said, we need the permit for everything. Well, an employer should not accept what the training instructor says. The employer should take control, right, and may disagree with what, a generic training course on arc flash and shock communicates to your workers. So you got to manage that as well.
So here's and Andre has a comments, if our battery system is greater than 50 volts DC or 60 volts DC especially, we have a greater than 600 volt DC system where we do not replace those batteries very often, would the electrical work permit be beneficial in that case?
Well, no, because again, the batteries are always going to have voltage present. So how do we disconnect the batteries? Without voltage present? So the permits, right?
Yeah.
Right. So if we need to work on batteries, at greater than 125 volts DC, there is arc flash and shock hazard. So you manage that risk with boundaries and PPE, but you don't need a permit to work on batteries, because how else do we work on the batteries? To disconnect them, to replace them, to do measurements if we need to, right? So because how else do we work on those batteries? We can't get rid of the voltage, right? So but we need to manage when we work on the batteries and that maximum voltage of concern, right? And then the available short circuit or fault current from those batteries that would then be converted into a DC arc flash. Remember, electrical hazard identification and risk assessment are separate from the permit.
And so then the final comment is from Carlos. He said, that was a great presentation. Congratulations.
And I appreciate the comment, a positive one like that, because Jim alluded at the beginning that when I do these webinars, I'm questioning the norm. I'm trying to bring information to the viewership on what I see out there that I think is not right, or it's a misinterpretation, or it's conservative, right? So, and again, each employer can decide ultimately, how to interpret 70E. But if I'm involved, I'm going to say, hey, do not let this energized electric work permit, become a bureaucratic process. It's not adding value. It's slowing things down, and we need to be, competitive in our organizations in North America, right? We need to make sure that we can continue to do what we do in a processing facility, in a manufacturing facility, right? And if you're shutting down your processing facility for the wrong reasons, then that, forgive me, although safety is the priority, we still have to manage economics in Canada and the US, right? Safety is the number one priority. But if the permit's being misapplied and you're shutting down your process all the time because you believe that you have to, that's not true, right? So manage the permit. If there is repair and alteration that's justified, then use the permit, right? So there's the other message. If there is justification for repair and alteration, I don't want to perform, but if there is, then you would use the permit, get the signatures, right? So again, even that statement's controversial. But hey, this is what I want to do, is make sure that we have these conversations and we interpret these two standards, and we get the benefits from them, but we don't let them have our workers refuse to do work because they think it's against the law, and without the permit, they're going to be reprimanded. That's not the intent of this permit whatsoever.
So thank you to the audience for attending today, and Terry, thank you for your presentation. We look forward to working with you down the road.
And Jim, thank you, and Easy Power, and thank everybody for attending. And I will get this PowerPoint and a PDF to Jim, and he can gladly share it on the Easy Power website.
Okay, have a good day for all.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.